Mission Possible, where we explore the frontiers beyond individual scale. I'm Anne Braithwaite, a systems navigator, and I'm fascinated by the potential hiding within our systems. Unleashing that potential is the secret, I believe, to tackling our biggest challenges that are too vast for any solo hero to take on alone. Each week, I'm speaking with visionaries who've discovered that our greatest resource doesn't lie in individual brilliance, rather, it's the incredible capacity that exists between us all. Join us as we discover how to tap that potential by working beyond boundaries, beyond individual scale. This season, we're focused on the natural hazard sector, and living in New Zealand, it's a sector dear to my heart. After all, this is one of the most hazard-prone countries on the planet. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Erica Seville. Erica's an expert in resilient organisations. Indeed, she founded a business called that and has written a book by the same name, full of practical tips and drawing on her many years of experience. I particularly loved our conversation when she was focusing in on recovery, often the poor cousin in this sector. It goes on after the heroics of the response are behind us, the exhaustion has set in. Recovery is still happening, and it is super complex. I really enjoyed what Erica had to do with this, and I think you'll love her Mission Possible. So without further ado, here's my chat with Erica. Erica Seville, welcome to the Mission Possible podcast. I'm so excited to have you here today. It's been a long time coming with everybody's busy schedules, but thank you so much for making the time to be with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Anne. Really excited to talk with you.
And it's been a while, so I know you've been up to lots of interesting things since we last spoke, but would you mind giving our listeners just a little quick rundown on your background so we know where you are, how you fit into the natural hazard sector, which is what this series is all about?
Well, I sort of got into this area way back. I originally did like an engineering degree and then thought to myself, oh my God, I'm not quite sure I want to be an engineer. How do I get out of it? And so I actually ended up specializing and went on and did my PhD in risk assessment and risk management. And that was really focused on things that can close the desert road. Volcanoes were going off at the time, snow and ice were closing the roads, really got into natural hazards and, how we respond to them and critical infrastructure from that perspective. And then really just thinking about risk management. And I was sort of working over in the UK when September 11th happened and was working in the banking and finance sector and just sort of saw all of the responses that they had to deal with there. So I started thinking more broadly about resilience and got into being a resilience researcher, did a lot of research here right through the Christchurch earthquakes and things, focusing on how organisations can get through crises. And more recently have moved into governance. So I am currently on the board of Toka, the Natural Hazards Commission, and also BRANZ, which is Building Research Association of New Zealand.
Erica, thanks. That's such a good story. And I know you've also written a book. Do you want to tell us about the book?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, after doing research for so long, we decided to write a book, Organisational Resilience, and really looking at how organisations can not only survive, but actually thrive through times of crisis and change and actually just bake it into their ethos and become better organisations because actually change and uncertainty are part of our BAU. They're not just for crises. Often organisations can pull off some pretty exciting stuff during times of crisis. And so it's how do you sort of capture that magic and organisation that can do stuff during the business as usual as well.
Absolutely. And I love how practical that book is. So it's deeply researched, but it's heavily practical. So it's not just sort of concepts and theories that people go, yeah, that's well and good, but it's really drawing on deep lived experience that people have gone through. So we know it works.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you sort of need to keep it simple. If it's not intuitive and it doesn't feel right, then it's quite hard to implement. So it's finding that nexus between making things that feel easy to implement.
Erica, that's probably a really good segue. We're talking about the natural hazard sector today. New Zealand, one of the most hazard-prone countries in the world. In my lifetime, natural hazards increased globally by just off the scale, 100%. And then we in Asia Pac experience about 30% more or less of the natural hazards out there. So we're punching above our weight yet again in this sector. You've given us a little outline of your sort of history and introduction to the field and now deep expert. I wondered if you could take us through what practices or beliefs do you reckon dominate the field at the moment, the thinking in the field, and particularly as relates to your experience and your exposure to it?
Yeah. I mean, it's challenging, isn't it? Because we've built up our society and the way we operate, where we've placed our cities. And then over time, our understanding of the vulnerabilities of those places and the way that we've built those systems has evolved. So we've got a whole lot of existing risk that we're needing to deal with. At the same time, we are still building, sometimes in silly places. And technology and society is actually changing really quickly. So it's thinking about how do we evolve both our places and the way we do things in our communities so that they can both avoid some of the future risks, so we're not baking even more in, but actually recognizing that doesn't matter what we do, sometimes the proverbial is going to hit the fan and hazards will come. And it's about thinking how we make those positive as they can be for communities, so that there are moments when communities come together, when we manage to capture the silver linings that come from those events and actually grow and evolve through them.
Great. So, Erica, talking about evolving, so we've come from almost habituated ways of working. We have how we like our communities to look and work, how that's made sense to us in the past. And we've had patterns of development, particularly if we think urban development, but it's the same rurally as well. You know, we've stripped slopes, we've farmed areas that possibly we shouldn't. So it's not just an urban problem, right? So we're talking the whole space. But you've talked about evolving. What are you picking up that's evolved in practices over the past, say, decade that you think have had the biggest impact, where you see the biggest shifts or the biggest potential shifts for us to leverage?
I think there are two biggest shifts that I would probably pick up. And the first one around recognizing that because society is complex, actually need diverse decision makers in the room together. Like it's not a problem that can be solved by someone in civil defence or one person in government. We actually need to get many different voices around the table. I mean, this has really come to the fore for me moving into governance, and the real power of being around a board table where others are bringing completely different perspectives to you. And the quality and the richness of the conversation is really important, but you also get such better decisions that come out of it. And so I think that is a recognition that has grown over the past few years, recognizing that we can't just solve something from an economic perspective. We can't just solve something from a health and well-being perspective, or from a housing perspective. Actually, all of these solutions need to work in together. Now, I don't think we've cracked, but I think there's a growing recognition of the challenge. The other shift that I see is a growing recognition of the transition between response and recovery. Response is the thing that happens immediately after an event, and it tends to be really heroic, and responses are quite adrenaline inducing. Recovery is the long, hard slog that sort of happens after it. To my mind, recovery has the more exciting potential, but is also more tricky and challenging, because recovery of a community doesn't happen in isolation of the event. Business as usual is happening through there. So I feel like while there's increasing recognition, we still haven't got very good tools for these people that we're throwing into the deep end after an event, are learning at the same time as doing. We haven't necessarily given them really good frameworks to be able to guide them through making the best decisions through that recovery process. So I think that's a real potential for us to focus on going into the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I talk often about things are now beyond individual scale, whether that be an individual person or an individual team or organisation, even a country. And so we see the limits of the individual, but the potential of us all together, the collective that we've got, the collective capacity, the collective thinking, the collective ambition even, and our intent when it's lined up. So it's lovely to hear that. Have you seen examples that you'd be able to share with our listeners, Erica, about where you've seen some of that potential, where you've seen some frameworks starting to grow, possible sparks of light around the system that you work in, where we can go we could look to that, and there's some things we could perhaps look to replicate or learn from that are really about those direct frameworks, practical approaches that we might give to our fellows in recovery to help. Well, our fellows, we're all people in recovery, right? It's not somebody else's job.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's still evolved, but like I think when for many years whenever we were talking with organizations that were going through crises, we'd sort of say, look, it's a unique little window of opportunity where actually change can happen, and change can happen quickly. So you want to think about what change do you want to drive during that window of opportunity. Organizations, for businesses, say you've probably got a strategic plan of things that you had been wanting to deliver over the next 10 years. You had a clear vision of where you wanted to go. Immediately after the event, it's quite tricky because you're in a high adrenaline state, but you need to take time out for business owners, take time out and think, where did I want to go? Is that still appropriate? Is that still where I want to go, given the world's changed with this event? If it is, how could I actually fast track that? How could I implement that over the next 2 years instead of the next 10 years? Because actually, the balls are all thrown up in the air with this event. You can implement it. We always say it's easier to make change. It was hard to make change when the sun's shining and the sea is calm. It's much easier to make change, when the balls are already up in the air and actually you can just reorganize them in a slightly different way. So I think the same thing goes for communities. Disaster events tend to amplify both our strengths, but they also really amplify a community's weaknesses. So they will show up existing fractures within the community, really highlight vulnerabilities or critical dependencies on different bits of infrastructure, or, if a community had issues with congestion before, often that's amplified post-event. What I see is starting to see the idea with all communities, I guess, that actually think about where you wanted to go. Don't focus on the disaster and what it's taken from you. Think about what is the change that you wanted to make anyway, and how do we leverage this as an opportunity to get there faster and easier than what might have otherwise occurred.
I love that. And just the positive spin on that. And it's not spin, it's just positive potential, positive opportunity that really exists. When I talk to people about uncertainty, I said, I'll take uncertainty over certainty any day of the week. Because when things are deeply certain, there's no possibility.
Yeah, and I think the other important thing is to think about giving people agency. Often within a crisis, people feel quite disempowered, and yet you always see the people who come through a crisis event and capture those opportunities are the ones that feel like they have the agency to affect their own recovery. And so I think those are some of the principles that also need to come into both our response and our recovery planning, is how do we actually give communities the ability to affect their own recovery? So we don't do recovery to them, we help them to recover. And I think that's really, really important. I saw it through the Christchurch earthquakes. I'm married to a structural engineer. I was busy in EOCs and everything right through that. Talking to lots of friends of mine who were married to engineers, the engineers were working such ridiculous hours over several years following the event. The engineers found it quite an empowering and quite a growth experience. The people who weren't necessarily hands deep in the doing actually found it much more of a struggle. People who get heavily involved in a response and recovery effort, they tend to come out of it feeling actually it was a growth opportunity. And so we need to find ways that people can get involved rather than sitting at home waiting to be told when and what they can do. Find little ways for people to actually become active within that response and recovery process.
Erica, that's really resonating. I've just come back from Northland last week, where I was at the Northland Emergency Management Forum. And I have to say, it was one of the most inspiring events I've been to in a long time. Now, when you ask people what they were actually doing, it was getting the agency there on all these very diverse and widely distributed communities that were very isolated. And I love your comment that things can be small steps. They don't have to be grand. And the things that were making a really big difference to communities were actually, on the face of things, quite small. But they were able to take control of that say, this is what we need, and be able to enact that rather than being told what they needed and it done to them. So that was a very, very powerful message that I picked up from just very recently, which I think echoes what you're talking about, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's wonderful. So we sort of flip from everyday kind of feet on the ground, hands on the wheel to, and we can really feel that, I think, as humans. We can just feel like, if I can just do something, I'm going to feel better. To a real flip now to technologies and methodologies. We've got so much that's flying at us. Of course, AI is a hot topic of the day. I remember working with you, it's mumble years ago now, it was pre-COVID, and we were talking about wetters up the drain pipe being AI-induced wetters that could go up and do building inspections. So this probably won't make much sense to listeners, but Erica will make sense of it for us, I'm sure, versus individuals. How could we use the Internet of Things in this space? But I'm sure there are other things that you're aware of, other emerging technologies, or even just approaches that you'd love to highlight that you think we should be paying attention to, or you've seen really kicking in the last 5 or more years that you think might be game changers for us?
Look, I think modeling to help our understanding. Like, one of the things that drives me a little bit nuts sometimes with modeling is modeling to get a number out, and a number doesn't really help. What I really like is modeling when it helps clarify that thought process and helps a group work through options. Should I take this course or should I take this course? One of the things I'm quite excited about is with AI, the complexity of modeling is going to be able to be enhanced, because models are always wrong. Models are always simplifications. And so one way that's useful, because for our poor little human minds, we can't really deal with too much complexity. So we like the simplicity within a model, helps us work through and understand cause and effect, etc. But as I was talking earlier, actually you need lots of different diverse viewpoints. So we can't be too reductionist in our modeling, or else we're going to end up optimizing on a narrow set of variables. But actually a community is a rich ecosystem, and we need to embrace that complexity. So what I really hope is that AI will help us to paint better pictures for decision makers, both immediately, before an event, really, to help prepare them for the decision making processes that they'll go through, to help paint the picture of different scenarios so that they can sort of see what might be coming out of the woodwork. What are the fishhooks of X, Y, and Z decision? And we're starting to get there with response. We're quite good there with hazard scenarios so that we can create the start of the response scenario for people to work through. But recovery's just epically more complex than that, because you've got all sorts of other effects coming in. You've got business as usual, global economies, supply chains and things starting to come into an effect. So it'd be really interesting, I think, in the future to think, can we have models that people can look through 3 or 4 different future scenarios and just try out to practice different responses and to see what sort of effects might emerge? I think that might help us to be a bit more curious, and also to maybe be a little bit more ambitious in some of our decision making, rather than just managing to reduce the worst of the effects. Maybe we could start being a bit more proactive and actually trying to affect the changes that we really want to see. And I think with tools like that, we might finally be able to give enough confidence to decision makers that they can be a bit more ambitious about that.
So, Erica, that's almost linking back to your early comment about using the situation that on the face of it is difficult and hard, and it is, but also as an opportunity to implement some of those things, maybe do 2 times in 2 years what we might otherwise take 10 years to do. We've seen that in COVID in many, many ways, and we've also seen the pendulum come back. So it makes me want to ask you this question, which I hadn't prepped you for. So perhaps go with this. What can we do to stop the pendulum coming all the way back to reset how things were before? I've seen it numerous times where we get all this momentum, we get a shift, we think it's there, and then quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, it comes back to, like, didn't we just learn from this? One of my favourite soapboxes to climb on is the one that says we haven't learnt the lesson until something different's done and sticks being done. So I call them lessons observed, but it's more that pendulum not coming back, or at least not coming back the whole way. I'm curious about your thoughts on that one.
Look, I feel like the pendulum is part of life. Like, we're never going to stop the pendulum doing its little swing thing. I guess sometimes we need to experience things 3 or 4 times for the lesson to actually stick. I mean, if you've got teenagers, you have to tell them things 50 million times before it starts sticking. I guess what I look for there is not necessarily the fast radical change, but to actually see that each time we grow a little bit, and be able to make shifts so that the next step is just that little bit easier. So it is inevitable that the pendulum swings, but the good thing, the bad thing with crises and particularly natural hazards is they come around with surprising regularity. So there's not too much time for pendulums to swing back too far. And I think that then is, thinking about that opportunity is jumping on those events. And if it's not your event, it might be someone else's burning platform. That might be an event that's happened overseas that you can go to your organization and say, look, it's happened here. What would happen if that happened here to us? So using other events to keep pushing that pendulum forward so that we're actually moving constantly in the right direction. That's the optimist in me, is to feel like, well, we'll get there eventually. Sometimes it is 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but so long as the general trend is always in the right direction.
And I love this idea of it starting to become sort of just a natural thing that we do, in the way that we scan the environment for market opportunities, we scan the environment for political shifts, as sort of an organisational discipline, looking at and learning from other events in other jurisdictions or in other industries that we might learn from as part of our kind of DNA of how we operate, is I think what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, absolutely. And just, looking forward, not think that we can predict the future. Like that's a fool's game. So really it's thinking about different scenarios of what the future might hold. And whenever you're making choices that will sort of work out across that full spectrum of scenarios. So not just optimizing on one future and betting the house on that one future, but just thinking, well, how would I stage gate this so that, as more information evolves, I can quickly switch. So keeping options open as well.
Is a lovely way, and I think part of what you bring to us all is that practical approach, which says, let's be really practical. Let's not try and answer all the questions because we can't, but let's consider possible opportunities, possible routes, possible ways of stepping through an issue.
People who tend to lead recovery, they're natural community leaders. Like, they're not specialists in disaster recovery. You want people who your community naturally see as leaders. So you can't necessarily, they're not trained for this role for a post-disaster recovery. So I think we need to get better at scaffolding them, to give them the tools immediately after the event so that they can be the very best, recovery leader that they're going to be. And working with who you've got, they'll come with their different experiences and things like that. It's just making it work for that community and for that leader.
Erica's so spot on and really resonant of what I've been hearing in recent weeks as well. So let's imagine for a moment an example of something in the field right now that feels completely impossible, so beyond our reach. It's like, I don't know what you're taking, Anne, but stop. It's just never going to happen. What would that be for you? What would be so transformative if we achieved it, but right now feels impossible? A moonshot, if you like, that you would love to see happen. It might be with your field, outside your field, but relating to our natural hazard sector. What could that moonshot look like if, only if we all got together on it?
Like, I think I'm going to come back to the modelling side of things and talk about something that will give communities a sense of the different phases and stages of what an event recovery will be like. And it comes back to this whole thing about people having agency to make their own decisions. And I remember after the Christchurch earthquakes, talking with Roger Sutton, who at that time, was chief executive of Orion. And he said, God, what I would have wished that we could have, rather than spending an extra $1 million on a transformer or whatever, what would have been really valuable was a system where people could have known what is the expected time frame for when the power is likely to come on for their home or for their neighborhood. And if we had have had that, that would have actually enabled people to make their own choices. They could have made decisions. Is it worth me getting a generator, or is it not worth me getting a generator? Is it worth me relocating for, is my power going to be back on in 3 days, 3 weeks, or 3 months? Those are big, chunky time frames. And without that information, people couldn't make good choices for themselves. And so my moonshot, I guess, would be for us after an event to be able to give the community a really clear picture of what those recovery timeframes might be. Time for water to be back on and power to be back on, for roads to be reopened, etc., so that people can start making choices about their personal family lives. Where am I going to need to relocate for work? Do I feel like my family can stay in situ? Can I make those sort of decisions? Now, on one level, that sounds quite a simple concept, but God, it's not, because all of those systems are so interdependent. Like the water requires the electricity, which requires the roads, etc. But to actually have something that can be updated as well in real time, because when you see that picture, inevitably people start making different choices. And so we might accelerate one area and down. But it's giving the power back to the community to make decisions of what is best for them following this event. Way people can affect their own recovery and make choices about their own recovery. That would be my moonshot.
I love that, Erica. What might it take as a first step to get that underway?
I actually think we've got a lot of the building blocks at the moment. So we've got a lot of the good hazard information. There's really good modelling that goes on. So within the Natural Hazards Commission, we do a lot of sort of modelling and things based on, riskscape and things. But I think it's about opening up those models to all of the different sectors. So, for example, we've got the, critical infrastructure sectors. They're not all government owned. A lot of them are privately owned. It's also about making those tools accessible so people can play with them. Like, I think if it just spits out a number, that's not terribly engaging. You sort of need something where people can pull levers backwards and forwards and say, no, I reckon that's too conservative. See what happens. So it would be a grand modelling effort. So I don't know, maybe AI will crack this nut for us and go, God, that was so easy. And in a few years' time, we'll look back and think, well, why didn't we think of that as an easy way of doing it? But yeah, I think we'll get there eventually. But it's also recognizing that as soon as you give people these decisions, it becomes even harder to predict outcomes. So this is the beauty, but also the challenge of complexity, is because then individual families are going to make decisions that are right for their individual families. And by them making a choice as to what to do, how to modify their behaviours, that creates a cascade of change, of things look like for their communities. I never think we'll be able to model it perfectly, but I don't think that's the point of the modelling. The point is to actually understand tipping points, to understand what's driving what's cause and effect, and what are the fish hooks that might emerge if we choose certain courses of action.
That, Erica, this just triggers for me. I love dealing with paradoxes, and you've just brought up a beautiful one, which is individual agency, families making choices that are right for them versus people making choices that are right for the collective whole, for the community, or being able to keep a few things under control, as it were, because we also have some on the other side of that argument who might say, yes, but people are random and do random things, which is very unhelpful to the overall picture that we're trying to do here for the greater good. We all know that the minute you put a human being in the middle of something, it becomes highly unpredictable. So what would you say to that, to the flip side of the argument? So we've got yes agency, yes individual decision making, and you've just highlighted how quickly that adds to the complexity. If our pendulum is swinging from individual agency to lockdown control, militaristic style approaches, what do you say to balance out the other side of the argument?
Yeah, and This is where response and recovery can sometimes be quite different beasts, because I think there is a time and a place for very top-down decision making, and in the immediate aftermath of an event is probably the most appropriate for that, when, people are trying to control the number of variables that they're dealing with, but it's not very sustainable over the long term. People don't like being instructed what to do for the long term. So you'll lose that control over people anyway. So actually better to do that gracefully and to do it in a way. So the beauty of actually giving people models or the ability to understand different variables is that they can actually see the net effect if they personally make this choice. What is the impact on my community? And you can start that as a conversation around, what are we trying to achieve collectively as a community? Get people inspired and excited so that they want to stay there. Because recovery is a long, hard journey, but people can put up with all sorts of stuff if they're brought into the vision at the end. I think sometimes we don't spend enough time painting the vision at the end because we don't want to be hit with a brick bat if we don't achieve that vision. Sometimes we set ourselves very high expectations. I think it is important to get people excited about what could be that emerges from an event. Yeah, so I think giving people the power, but also painting the vision for them so that you hope that they act collectively and not just individually. But you can't tie people in a bind and force them to do things. We need to find the win-win, really.
Erica, thank you for that. Any last comments, anything I haven't asked you that you've got on your mind that you're just desperate to get out there in relation to this? I'd love to give you the stage for a couple of minutes just to say your piece. If Erica got on her soapbox, what would it be?
Look, I'm one of those crazy people who actually quite like disasters. And that sounds, I know that makes me sound like a dreadful person, but they do offer a unique little window into our society where actually amazing communities come together, communities pull off amazing things. And what I would really like to find is how do we actually bring that more into our business as usual, into our day to day? How do we make the good parts of a crisis recovery actually occur every day? So that would be me. Sometimes, it forces us to think outside of the box. It forces us to say, actually, we can't do it the old way. How do we find a new way of doing things? When our feet aren't to the fire of in business as usual, we don't often get forced to think quite creatively like that. That's my plea, is for people to sometimes just think out of the box and bring some of those essences of disaster recovery into our business as usual.
Erica, thank you. It's been absolutely delightful having you as a guest and everything I'd hoped for. Thanks for being with us today on Mission Possible.
Great. Thanks, Anne. Lovely to talk with you.
What a wonderful chat with Erica Seville. And it's really got me thinking. As a big history fan, I often see things in the past, things our forebears already figured out long before we came along, things that can teach and inspire us today. And I call this old ways, new ways. Erica's Moonshot about modelling information, making it available to us in the public as well as the private to make agency in our decision making and recovery really reminded me of something the Romans, those clever old Romans, had figured out a long time ago. I'm going to take you back to 62 CE, and we're in Pompeii and Herculaneum. They've just had an enormous earthquake, 5 to 6 they estimate on the Richter scale, so that's big in anyone's books. Well, the Romans already had a well-established way of communicating with their citizens just in daily life. But in disasters, those clever old Romans had a system called Tituli, and going back to high school Latin, it's simply an inscription, often on stone, sometimes on brass. That was an official communication that was taken out to the public. They were prominently displayed throughout the city, and those inscriptions communicated critical recovery information. So, exactly what was damaged, who was funding the repairs, when work would be completed, and which officials were responsible. Things that Erica would love us all to have access to today. We talked about when's the power back up, when's the road going to open, when's the bridge back, all these decisions that can help us make smart decisions as individuals, businesses and communities. What made the system really effective was its transparency and its authority, as well as its accessibility. The inscriptions were created by skilled craftsmen working together, from everyone from the masons, stonemasons carving them, to those in authority who had source of that information. They were displayed in all sorts of places where everybody could see them, and they were backed by these trusted institutions. In fact, it was a criminal offence if anything on them was incorrect. By combining detailed factual information with that public accountability, the Romans created a disaster recovery communication system that built community trust and enabled this amazing decision-making at all levels of society. And I think these are principles we could look back to and ask ourselves, how well are we doing in our modern disaster response and recovery communications? Can we learn something from the Romans? I think we can. Thanks for putting your head together with ours. As those of us who went before us, like those Romans, already knew, there's nothing we can't do together, even if we haven't done it before. So I say, let's go beyond the individual and harness our collective capacity, our collective potential. I'm Anne Braithwaite. This is Mission Possible. See you next time.